So why did I decide to call the monastery Christ the Bridegroom Monastery? It's a good question. My relationship with Jesus as bridegroom blossomed when I was a young adult. And now being a nun, he has become more and more my desire and my fulfillment. Honestly, I believe that it was God's decision. It was his will to deign the monastery to be called Christ the Bridegroom Monastery and not mine. And now, 10 years later, I know it is. And it's not only his will for the nuns of the monastery to live their lives in this relationship, but it's an invitation to a reality revealed to all who visit the monastery, especially for those who come on retreat to encounter Jesus as their bridegroom. For all whom we encounter at the monastery and outside the monastery, and for all those whom we pray for. The image, or better yet, the relationship with God as our bridegroom is not novel. It's actually very ancient. And in the Old Testament in particular, in the book of prophets, the prophets anticipate and point to this bridegroom Messiah who is going to come to his people and wed them in an eternal covenant. In the Gospel of John, John the Baptist sees Jesus walking by the River Jordan and says, "Behold the bridegroom." And John also identifies himself as the friend of the bridegroom. Our liturgy, especially during Holy Week, we celebrate bridegroom matins on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then throughout Holy Week, we walk with Jesus as we witness his passion and death as he lays his life down for his bride. And then during Resurrection Matins, one of my favorite hymns that we sing is that Jesus comes forth from the tomb as a bridegroom from his bridal chamber. Can't get much more explicit than that. Well, you could, but we're not going to go there. But honestly, Jesus Christ as our bridegroom is scriptural, it's liturgical, and it's foundational in our relationship with him and in the world. And Jesus, the bridegroom Messiah, is who and what we desire. And he's our ultimate fulfillment.
Our liturgical prayer in the chapel informs our relationship with Christ the bridegroom by situating us within the communal context of who we are as the church. It protects us from the error of thinking that our relationship with God can ever be a merely personal matter of just me and Jesus. It's with the church's voice that we pray, and we stand for her before the loving and purifying gaze of her bridegroom day after day. In the liturgy, we are taught by the church fathers, the saints, by Christian tradition, who the Trinity is and who we are to him. It's said that in the East we sing our theology because we sing all of our prayers. So when we sing of Christ who had two distinct natures while remaining one person, or Christ who took on flesh in a union without confusion, we just taste the mysterious and explosive magnitude of a God who became man in order to unite himself to his wayward bride. Through the feast of the liturgical year, we enter into the mysteries of our bridegroom's earthly life as our prayers distill for us centuries of the church's meditation on these mysteries. As a bride is intimately familiar with and bears witness to her husband's life, so we immerse ourselves in Israel's history, in her story, and in the Gospels, which reveal God's passionate pursuit of his bride even unto death. And the goal of all of this is to allow his reality to so penetrate our hearts that it brings forth a fruitful union that encompasses our whole life, not just the hours that we spend in the chapel each day.
People sometimes ask us, why is this the image of Christ as bridegroom? Why not something happier? Why not Jesus in his glory? Well, this is his glory. He is about to lay down his life for his bride. This is the ultimate act of spousal love, an act that all husbands are called to do for their brides. Jesus does this in the fullest sense by literally dying. This icon is placed on the tetrapod during Holy Week, which is also called the Week of the Bridegroom. It's the week of his suffering. In our monastery, since this is our patronal icon, we keep this icon on the tetrapod the whole year to keep always before our eyes the total outpouring of love of Christ for us, and to remind us of our call to imitate this complete gift of self, this dying to self. To point out a few things in the icon, the crown is a symbol in the Byzantine tradition of marriage. The ropes binding his hands are a nearly universal symbol of marriage. The dark red or purple robe is the robe of mockery that he willingly accepts, but also a sign of his true royalty as the divine Son of God. And the reed is a symbol of humility. In the monastery, we have a lot of suffering, which comes in many different forms. All people suffer, but we as Christians, as part of his bride, the church, are invited in our suffering to take on the appearance of Christ, to actually start to look like our spouse, by willingly consenting to the suffering given to us as he did, and to unite it to his in an outpouring of ourselves.
When John refers to Jesus as the bridegroom and himself as the friend of the bridegroom, that would have called forth in the Jewish people a lot of marital imagery, specifically for a Jewish marriage. The Jewish groom did three things. The night before his marriage, he shared a sacred meal with his closest friends. And this is not in the way we think about like a bachelor party, the way we do it. This would have been more in the sense of a retreat. And the elder men, specifically the friend of the bridegroom, would have instructed the groom in the duties of love. And it was a very sacred time. The second thing that the groom would do is he would have this grand procession with the bride where they'd be elevated on chairs and he'd wear a garland and they would process in this grand procession from the groom's house to the bride's house. And then the third thing would be that they would be taken into the bridal chamber to consummate the marriage. And this is the sign of new life being brought forth into the world. And of course we see all of this in the gospel when Jesus shares this sacred meal with his closest friends, and he says, "This is my body. This is not a contract. This is sacramental language. This is marital language. This is the language of a covenant." And his procession is the way of the cross, and the wood of the chair is the wood of the cross, and his garland is the crown of thorns. And at the foot of his cross is the new friend of the bridegroom, John the Beloved, who's standing in for the friend of the bridegroom who'd been beheaded. And he hears Jesus say, "It is finished, it is consummated." And new life is brought forth, and the church is born. And Adam and Eve, and their spiritual sterility is undone with Eve's yes, and the new bridegrooms. You can just see the new bridegroom crushing the glass under his foot as Mary is crushing the head of Satan under her feet. And this is our bridegroom on the cross.
We are a Byzantine Catholic women's monastery in the Eparchy of Parma, living in and drawing others into the spousal love of Christ through prayer and hospitality.
And coming to Christ the Bridegroom Monastery, being with the sisters, seeing their joy, seeing their love for our Lord and his love for them, draws my soul to open itself little by little, to recognize and to love Christ and his graces, his immense love for me.
We have come to know Christ the Bridegroom Monastery through Mother Gabriella, was Maggie's friend growing up, and during that time we didn't really know the Byzantine rite all that much, and it was a wonderful opportunity to grow an appreciation and understanding for the beautiful traditions that are in that rite, and for me in particular, really helped me encounter Christ in a deeper way. Especially for me, going on Pistinia has been a wonderful blessing. This is going to be my 4th year going on Pistinia, and plan to do it hopefully for the rest of my life, because it's been so life-giving. And for me, I can feel Christ there. The presence of the nuns have just made that a super holy place, and it's a time that I look forward to every year, just to reflect and to really encounter him in a deep way. One of the things I've learned over the years, actually a monk told me at one point that monasteries like Christ the Bridegroom are like the arm that holds up the church, and the prayer and penance that the nuns and religious throughout the world give to the church is really what gives us our strength and our ability to spread the gospel in a deeper way.
And I've been to the monastery a few times, just once for retreat, and in the busyness of my life as a mom of 4 kids, it was a good reminder that we all should have that monastic life in our hearts, like to be able to carry that on our interior. I was able to bring that home in a little bit of a deeper way just from being at the monastery. And just for our kids to go and see the nuns just in prayer for Vespers or for anything, for a work day, just for them to be able to see the nuns and how they live out their life has been a really beautiful reminder.
God bless Mom and Dad and Grace and Gabriel and Abigail. Oh, Clarence. Oh, Pia. Oh, Dulcis. Virgo Maria.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Our monastery aspires to remind all baptized Christians of this personal invitation to union with Christ as their bridegroom, and to renew a healthy, integrated view of the human person, body, and soul.
I have found that they combine a unique charism, or they combine things that normally are kept separate. And that's what's really charming to me, is that what they combine is the human and the spiritual. So if you're anything like me, you tend to think of monasteries or nuns or maybe even priests, and you think spiritual. And for whatever reason, I always think of like Buddhist monks in the mountains separated from things. And then you think of like a really human event, and you think of a party and hugs and wine and good food. Well, if you go to the monastery, you're going to pray hard. There's icons, and it's a Byzantine style of prayer, and it's a lengthy prayer times, and you're giving yourself to God. But then afterwards, there's wine and food and hugs and laughter, and not one thing is praised above the other. They know that both are needed. That's because they hone in on the Christian understanding that in order to get to God, you've got to go deep into the authentic human. The Word became flesh, and so the way to the spiritual is through the human. You can't run away from your humanity. I can't pretend I don't have these desires or thoughts or whatever in order to get to God. It's entering deeply into these places in our hearts and in our bodies that we actually come to find God. And Christ the Bridegroom Monastery espouses that wonderfully and embodies that in a way that's very disarming, but above all, very consoling.
Holy, holy, holy are you, O God, through the intercession of the Theotokos